The West largely blames Vladimir Putin for the war in Ukraine. His actions have been scrutinized and criticized by many international leaders and organizations. He is often portrayed as a ruthless autocrat, a leader who will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. His goal, they say, is to rebuild the Soviet Empire, to restore Russia to its former glory and influence. The invasion of Ukraine, in this view, was unprovoked and a blatant act of aggression. It has caused immense suffering and displacement for countless Ukrainians. It violated international law and threatened the global order, prompting a strong response from the international community. Western leaders point to Putin's words and actions as evidence of his intentions. They argue that his rhetoric and policies are clear indicators of his ambitions. They cite his speeches and writings, which often reflect a desire to reclaim lost territories and influence. These often express a longing for the Soviet Union, a time when Russia was a superpower on the global stage. He feels Russia was mistreated after its collapse, that the West took advantage of Russia's weakened state. Putin has questioned Ukraine's independence, suggesting that it is not a legitimate state. He suggests it is historically part of Russia and that its current borders are artificial and imposed by the West. The West stresses the need to confront Putin's aggression, to prevent further destabilization in the region. They aim to deter further expansion by showing a united front and increasing military readiness. This has led to sanctions against Russia, targeting its economy and key industries. The West sends military aid to Ukraine, providing weapons, training and support to help them defend their sovereignty. NATO has strengthened its presence in Eastern Europe with more troops and resources deployed to member states. The message is clear. Putin's actions will have consequences. The international community will not stand by and allow aggression to go unchecked. The world stands with Ukraine, showing solidarity through protests, diplomatic efforts and humanitarian aid. The resolve to support Ukraine remains strong.
John J. Mearsheimer offers a different perspective. He argues that the West, not Putin, is primarily responsible. Mearsheimer blames the West's pursuit of NATO expansion. He argues that enlarging NATO after the Cold War threatened Russia. Mearsheimer points out that NATO is a military alliance. Its expansion towards Russia's borders alarmed Moscow. Russia saw this as hostile encirclement. Ukraine joining NATO was a red line for Russia. Mearsheimer believes the West ignored Russia's security concerns. The West, he argues, should have sought an understanding with Russia. Instead, it isolated and weakened Russia. This included NATO expansion, support for pro-Western groups in Ukraine, and sanctions. These actions, Mearsheimer believes, made war more likely.
To understand the war, we must examine Putin's actions and delve into his motives. The West paints him as an aggressor, a leader with expansionist ambitions. But a closer look reveals a more complex picture, one that involves historical grievances and strategic calculations. Putin says the conflict is a response to NATO expansion, which he views as a direct threat to Russian security. He feels Russia was forced to act to protect its sovereignty and regional influence. Putin claims his warnings about NATO were ignored, leading to heightened tensions. He accuses the West of orchestrating a coup in Ukraine in 2014, a pivotal moment in his narrative. This, he says, was to install a pro-Western government that would undermine Russian interests. While disputed, these claims reveal Russia's deep sense of threat and encirclement. Putin's actions before the invasion don't necessarily show a planned conquest, but rather a series of strategic moves. He did move troops to Ukraine's border, a clear show of force. But he also engaged in diplomacy, seeking to negotiate terms that would address Russia's security concerns. He wanted to address Russia's security concerns through dialogue and agreements. These efforts failed, leading to the special military operation, a term Putin uses to describe the invasion. The international community remains divided on the legitimacy of Putin's actions, with ongoing debates about the true motives behind the conflict. Understanding these actions and motives is crucial for comprehending the broader geopolitical implications of the war.
Russia sees the war as a fight for security. The nation believes that its sovereignty and territorial integrity are under constant threat from external forces. This perception drives its military strategies and foreign policies, aiming to fortify its borders and protect its national interests. It wants to maintain influence in its neighboring countries. These regions are seen as vital to Russia's strategic depth and economic interests. By exerting influence, Russia aims to create a sphere of friendly or neutral states that can act as a buffer against potential adversaries. NATO expansion is a direct threat to its interests. The eastward movement of NATO is perceived as encroachment on Russia's traditional sphere of influence. This expansion brings NATO's military infrastructure closer to Russian borders, heightening Moscow's sense of vulnerability. Russia views the conflict as a proxy war with the West. The geopolitical struggle is seen as a contest for dominance in Eastern Europe, with both sides vying for control and influence. This perspective fuels Russia's determination to assert its power and resist Western encroachment. Russia has always sought influence in former Soviet republics. These nations are considered part of Russia's historical and cultural sphere. Maintaining influence in these areas is seen as essential for Russia's national identity and regional stability. It sees them as a buffer zone. This buffer is crucial for Russia's defense strategy, providing a layer of protection against potential invasions or military threats from the West. The buffer zone concept is deeply rooted in Russia's historical experiences of invasions. The Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan protests in 2014 worried Moscow. These movements were seen as Western-backed efforts to pull Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate it into Western political and economic structures. Russia saw these events as Western attempts to undermine its influence. The support for these uprisings was interpreted as a direct challenge to Russia's authority and a threat to its strategic interests in the region. The annexation of Crimea and support for separatists were defensive measures in Russia's view. These actions were taken to protect Russian-speaking populations and to secure strategic military assets, such as the Black Sea Fleet based in Crimea. Russia also feels the West is hypocritical. It criticizes Western nations for their interventions in other countries while condemning Russia's actions. This perceived double standard fuels resentment and mistrust towards Western policies. It points to NATO's intervention in Kosovo and the invasion of Iraq. These actions are cited as examples of Western aggression and interference in sovereign nations, which Russia argues are similar to its own actions in its near abroad. Russia believes the West acts aggressively without consequence. It sees a pattern of Western military interventions that go unpunished, while Russia's actions are met with sanctions and international condemnation. It argues that its own security concerns are ignored. Russia feels that its legitimate security needs are dismissed by the West, leading to a sense of isolation and the need to take unilateral actions to protect its interests.
NATO's role in the conflict is debated. NATO claims to be a defensive alliance, but its eastward expansion after the Cold War increased tensions with Russia. Moscow saw the admission of former Soviet countries into NATO as a betrayal. Several factors drove NATO's expansion. These included supporting democracy in Eastern Europe and containing Russia. Critics argue that expansion backfired. It provoked Russia and created mistrust. They say NATO should have cooperated with Russia after the Cold War. The debate over NATO expansion will continue. It raises questions about European security. Finding a way to address Russia's concerns without compromising sovereignty is a challenge.
Ukraine is trapped between Russia and the West. Its history and geography make it a bridge between East and West. But they also make it vulnerable to conflict. Its large Russian-speaking population and strategic location make it important to Russia. Since independence in 1991, Ukraine has struggled to balance its relationships. The Orange Revolution and Euromaidan protests showed deep divisions within Ukraine. Some want closer ties with Europe, others prefer close ties with Russia. The annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine worsened these divisions. The war has devastated Ukraine. It has caused death, destruction, displacement, and economic hardship. Ukraine's future is uncertain. It will likely remain a point of geopolitical competition.
The war has had a heavy cost for everyone. Thousands of soldiers and civilians are dead. The conflict has destroyed infrastructure and displaced millions. The war has also impacted the global economy. It has disrupted supply chains, increased inflation, and worsened food insecurity. The human cost is immeasurable. Families are torn apart, communities are shattered. The trauma of war will last for generations. The destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals has created a humanitarian crisis. The war has also damaged relations between Russia and the West. It has increased geopolitical rivalry and raised concerns about escalation and nuclear war. The conflict highlights the need for diplomacy to resolve disputes.
The war continues, with no end in sight. Neither side can achieve a decisive victory. Negotiations have failed to bring a breakthrough. The war has deepened tensions and raised fears of a wider conflict. Peace in Ukraine faces many obstacles. There is deep mistrust between the sides. They have conflicting goals. External actors are involved. Any solution must address the root causes of the conflict. This includes Ukraine's neutrality, security guarantees, and addressing Russia's concerns about NATO.
The international community must help find a peaceful solution. Diplomacy should focus on de-escalation and confidence building. Sanctions should be used carefully. They should not worsen the humanitarian crisis or isolate Russia further. A lasting peace requires commitment from all sides. They must be willing to engage in dialogue, compromise, and work towards a shared vision of a secure Europe. The human cost of this war is a stark reminder of the failure of diplomacy. It underscores the need for a rules-based international order that respects the sovereignty of all nations. A just and lasting peace must address the legitimate security concerns of all parties involved.
The war in Ukraine is a tragedy for all involved. It is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the failure to find peaceful solutions. As we look towards the future, the focus must shift from the battlefield to the negotiating table. Rebuilding trust and establishing a lasting peace will require a concerted effort from all stakeholders. This includes addressing the root causes of the conflict, ensuring the security of all nations, and fostering a more cooperative and stable international order.